Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Trevor Sutton lit the grill for a peaceful weekend on his lakeside land, he never imagined it would ignite a war. But when an overzealous HOA president storms in, armed with fake rules and a tablet, the line between private property and madness starts to blur. The air in Montana has a sharpness to it that you can taste. A mix of pine resin, lake water, and wood. Smoke that seems to reset your lungs with every breath. That's why I bought these 64 acres in the first place. Half of it is forest. Half of it curls around the shoreline of Falls Bay Lake. And right in the middle stands a weathered log cabin my family and I have turned into a place for weekends like this one. By Friday evening, my sister had arrived with her 2 kids. My father shuffled in carrying more food than an army could eat, and a couple of close friends pitched their tents along the tree line. We'd set up a small barbecue pit with a steel fire ring, dragged out the kayaks, and marked off a play area for the kids. Everything was by the book. Fireproof mats under the grills, water buckets placed at each corner, and a stack of extinguishers I kept just to make sure nobody could say I wasn't cautious. The morning sun painted the lake silver, and I found myself flipping burgers while my nephew chased dragonflies and my father whittled away at a piece of cedar like he was auditioning for frontier life. The air carried that lazy hum of laughter, clinking bottles, and sizzling meat. It wasn't a rager, it was family, quiet, safe, and private. I had invested years restoring this land with ecological protections, planting native grass to prevent erosion, setting up composting toilets for campers, even working with the county to make sure the picnic area complied with every ridiculous regulation they could think up. Out here, I didn't answer to bosses, neighbors, or committees, just the wind and the water. That illusion broke around 4 in the afternoon. I noticed her first as a flicker of movement through the trees, then a figure emerged onto the path that cut down toward our fire pit. She was in her 50s, wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat, a reflective safety vest like she had just stepped out of a roadwork crew, and clutching a tablet against her chest as if it were the 10 Commandments. The way she marched down the slope, chin raised, gave off the aura of a school principal on the first day back from summer. "Excuse me," she barked before she was even close enough for pleasantries. "What do you think you're doing here?" I set down the spatula, blinking at her. "Grilling lunch on my own property. Who might you be?" The woman snapped the tablet awake and pointed it at me as though scanning barcodes. "Karen Brody, president of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association, and what you're doing is a violation of our environmental rules. Fires near water are strictly prohibited. Gatherings without HOA approval are prohibited. You're endangering protected shoreline." My father gave a snort of laughter from his chair. My sister shot me a worried glance, but I kept my voice calm. "Ma'am, this isn't part of Lakeshore Estates. This is private property registered to me. You've walked off your development's trail and onto land that doesn't belong to your HOA. I have permits for this fire pit. I've met every safety requirement, and you are the one trespassing." Her eyes narrowed like I'd spoken blasphemy. "All parcels adjacent to the community fall under HOA jurisdiction. This lakefront is ours to regulate. You cannot just play cowboy and burn whatever you like. These rules exist to protect us all." I wiped my hands on a towel and stepped closer, not aggressive, just firm. "Listen carefully. This cabin was built before your subdivision even existed. The county records are crystal clear. This acreage is separate. My deeds list the water line, and your rules stop at your property fence. You're standing on the wrong side of the boundary. I suggest you head back before you embarrass yourself." Karen's mouth twisted like she had just bitten into a lemon. She tapped frantically on her tablet, as though the screen would suddenly erase my deed and replace it with hers. After a few tense moments, she jabbed a finger at me. "This isn't over. You're creating a hazard. I'll have law enforcement here within the hour." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed back up the trail, muttering about bylaws and citations. The forest swallowed her up, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and the stunned silence of my family. My niece whispered, "Who was that lady?" My father muttered something about tin pot dictators, and I forced a smile I didn't feel. "Don't worry," I said, though my jaw had gone tight. "She'll be back, but so will I." Karen didn't disappoint. About half an hour later, the crunch of tires rolled up the gravel path, and 2 Sheriff's Department SUVs came into view. My father muttered something under his breath that I won't repeat in front of the kids, and my sister herded them closer to the cabin porch just in case. Out stepped two officers in uniform, one older, stocky, with the weathered face of a man who had mediated 1,000 small-town disputes. The other, younger and stiff, as though he had swallowed the academy manual that morning. And there, glued to their side like she was leading the parade, was Karen in her vest, holding her tablet aloft as if it were Exhibit A in a criminal trial. She wasted no time. "Officers, thank God you're here. This man," she jabbed her finger at me like I was an armed fugitive, "is conducting illegal burns on a protected lakeshore, hosting unauthorized gatherings, and ignoring HOA environmental bylaws. He's endangering lives and property." The older officer, who introduced himself as Sergeant Bryn, raised an eyebrow and turned to me. "Afternoon. You the property owner?" "Yes, sir. Name's Trevor Sutton. I own this parcel outright. 64 acres registered under my name. Half forest, half lakefront. Everything you see here is on my deed." Karen barked a laugh. "Don't believe him. He's making that up. HOA rules are clear. This shoreline is regulated. I opened the folder I had pulled from the cabin just in case. Here's the deed, stamped and certified by the county clerk. Here's the registration for the fire pit, issued by the Department of Natural Resources. And here are the inspection reports confirming compliance with fire safety codes. Water buckets and extinguishers are in plain sight." Bryn took his time flipping through the documents while the younger officer walked around inspecting the area. He pointed at the extinguishers, checked the fire ring, even nodded at the composting toilet setup I'd built near the tree line. He whispered something to Bryn, who looked up at me with the faintest of smiles. "Mr. Sutton," he said, "everything here looks proper, and you're correct. Your land isn't listed under Lakeshore Estates HOA jurisdiction." He turned his gaze on Karen and his voice sharpened. "Ma'am, you crossed a private boundary line and called in a report that doesn't check out. That's a false call. Not only that, you're technically trespassing." Karen's face went from red to purple. "What? No. You can't take his side. He's breaking the law. He has to be. Why else would he be hiding out here?" I let out a dry laugh. "Hiding? This cabin's been in open use for years. You're the one trespassing on a Saturday afternoon barbecue." The younger officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, state law is clear. Private property means HOA authority doesn't apply. You've misused emergency services. The penalty is a fine. Consider this an official warning for trespass as well." Karen's mouth worked soundlessly, like she was trying to swallow the words before they came out. Finally, she shrieked, "This county is corrupt. You're all in on it. You'll hear from my attorney." Sergeant Bryn didn't flinch. He pulled out a citation pad, scribbled briskly, and handed it to her. "Ma'am, sign here acknowledging receipt of the fine. You can dispute it in court if you like." She scrawled something that looked more like an insult than a signature, snatched the paper, and stormed off toward the trail, still shouting about conspiracies and community standards. The officers exchanged looks that said they'd seen this circus before. Bryn tipped his hat to me. "Sorry for the trouble, Mr. Sutton. Enjoy your afternoon. We'll file the report." When they drove off, the silence felt almost too heavy, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. My sister exhaled shakily. My father chuckled and cracked open another beer. "Well," he said, "looks like you've got yourself a fan club president." I forced a smile, but in the back of my mind, a voice whispered the obvious. Karen wasn't finished. People like her never were. The next week should have been quiet. I returned to work on a restoration project in town, spent my evenings checking emails, and hoped the whole incident would fade into one of those absurd stories you laugh about years later. But by the following Saturday, it was clear Karen had no interest in letting go. When I drove back up to the property to mow the clearing near the cabin, I nearly slammed the brakes. A waist-high fence of plastic post and mesh stretched across the entrance to my driveway, topped with a neat row of little HOA flags flapping in the breeze. In front of it, 2 orange construction cones had been dropped like this was some official government project. A laminated sign read, "Community Pathway Expansion, Lakeshore Estates HOA. Access restricted." I sat there in my truck for a good minute, staring at the ridiculous barricade. It looked like a grade school project built with too much free time and too little authority. I stepped out, tugged at one of the posts, and the whole line wobbled like a cheap Halloween prop. Just then, a pickup rattled down the road, and a man in a contractor's vest leaned out. "Hey, you Sutton?" "Yeah," I said, bracing myself. Look, don't shoot the messenger. Some lady, Karen I think, paid us cash to install that fence. Said it was community land, part of an HOA project. I thought it was weird, but work's work. We were supposed to come back tomorrow to pour cement posts. I laughed, though it came out sharper than I intended. This isn't HOA land. This is my driveway. She lied to you. The contractor grimaced. Figures. We get folks like that sometimes. Tell you what, call the sheriff if you want. We're not touching another shovel until it's cleared up. He tipped his cap and drove off, leaving me standing with my so-called restricted access. By the time I'd phoned the county dispatch, Karen was already back on scene, marching down the road. Like she owned the whole forest. She saw me tearing down the mesh and screamed, "Stop! That's HOA property. You're destroying community improvements." Minutes later, a deputy arrived, the same younger officer from before. He took one look at the fence, one look at my deed copy, and ordered it removed immediately. Karen sputtered threats about lawsuits and easements until the deputy finally told her, "Ma'am, keep this up and you'll be charged with harassment." She stomped off, red-faced, but I knew better than to think it was over. The next attack came in paper form. By Tuesday, I received a letter from the Department of Natural Resources requesting an inspection after multiple citizen complaints, alleging environmental damage from my camp area. The wording made it obvious who had filed them. 2 days later, a reporter showed up at my gate asking if I had a comment about being a wealthy developer destroying pristine shoreline. I stood there holding a rake, still in work gloves, while the guy pointed a camera at me. "I'm not a developer," I snapped. "I'm an environmental architect. I restore land. My barbecue pit has more safety certifications than your studio equipment." He chuckled awkwardly and left, but the seed had been planted. That night, a local blog ran a headline, "Lakefront owner accused of eco-violations." No name was attached to the source, but the phrasing dripped with Karen's vocabulary. At dinner, my father warned me, "She's escalating. People like her only stop when someone makes them." My sister nodded, her face drawn. "Trevor, maybe it's time you get a lawyer. She won't just wander off." I looked out over the lake that had been my refuge and felt the familiar tightness in my jaw. Karen wanted a war. She was going to get one. By the end of that month, the whole affair had moved from nuisance to siege. Karen wasn't satisfied with flags and blog posts. She wanted a full-scale crusade. I found out the hard way one evening when a pair of county inspectors showed up unannounced, clipboards in hand, asking to review possible code violations reported by concerned citizens. Their truck still had the dust of a dozen similar calls on it. They walked the property line with me, measuring tapes clicking out like insect legs. One crouched near the fire pit, noting the steel ring and water barrels. The other checked the composting toilets and stormwater drains I had installed. After an hour of poking, prodding, and murmuring, they both looked at each other and shrugged. "Mr. Sutton," the older one said, "everything here is not only up to code, it's exemplary. Whoever filed the complaint either doesn't understand regulations or they're deliberately wasting our time." I didn't need to guess which it was. When I asked if they could disclose the complainant, the inspector gave a tired smile. "Can't give you a name, but let's say the handwriting on the forms looked very familiar." That same week, Karen held what she called an emergency HOA meeting. A sympathetic neighbor who had no patience for her antics forwarded me photos from the gathering. On the projector screen were crudely altered property maps, my acres highlighted in HOA green, the lakefront shaded as if it belonged to her community. She pointed at the screen with the gusto of a general unveiling a battle plan. The captions read, "Unauthorized encroachment" and "Seized shoreline." Some residents nodded along, but others looked uneasy. I could see doubt in their faces, even from grainy cell phone pictures. It was one thing to gripe about grass height. It was another to claim ownership of land that had been in my deed for years. Karen didn't stop at theatrics. Letters began landing in my mailbox like artillery shells, copies of notices she had mailed to local agencies. One accused me of illegally diverting stormwater. Another claimed I was planning to build rental cabins without permits. One particularly imaginative note accused me of introducing invasive plant species for profit. I had to laugh at that one. I was literally employed to remove invasive species. But the laughter wore thin when actual reporters began circling back, demanding comment on allegations. I realized Karen's strategy wasn't about winning legally. It was about burying me in enough noise that someone somewhere would believe her. I decided I wasn't going to sit back and keep swatting at each mosquito. I drove into town and sat down with an attorney recommended by a colleague, sharp-eyed, blunt, the type who smelled blood in paperwork. I unloaded the stack of letters, maps, and inspection reports onto her desk. She skimmed, whistled low, and finally looked up. "Mr. Sutton, this isn't petty neighbor drama anymore. This is harassment, fraud, and potentially libel. If she's altering cadastral records, that's a felony. You've got grounds to hit back hard." Walking out of that office, deed folder tucked under my arm like a weapon, I felt the shift. Up until now, I'd been reactive, patching leaks in a dam Karen kept hammering. But if she wanted escalation, I was ready to oblige. The difference was, I intended to fight with the one thing she couldn't fake: evidence. There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a forest when you're collecting ammunition, not the kind that fits in a rifle, but in court filings, affidavits, and time-stamped footage. I spent the next week doing exactly that. My lawyer, Denise, was a specialist in property rights and had the demeanor of a pissed-off librarian with subpoena power. She didn't just build cases, she constructed kill shots. We began by gathering everything. Emails from contractors confirming Karen had hired them under false pretenses. County inspection reports clearing my land of violations. Screenshots from HOA meeting videos showing doctored boundary maps. My deed, surveyed plat, and title history stretching back to the Roosevelt administration. Then came the tech. I upgraded my trail cams and security systems, placing high-resolution cameras along the boundary lines and near the cabin. Within days, I had footage of Karen pacing just inside my tree line, phone in hand, snapping photos of my fire pit like she was documenting a crime scene. In one clip, she even dragged a tape measure along my gravel path and wrote notes in a spiral-bound pad like she was a one-woman zoning board. "Do you realize what this is?" Denise asked, watching one of the videos. "She's building false reports in real time. This isn't just annoyance, it's a campaign." She drafted a formal cease and desist, citing harassment, libel, and trespassing. We had it delivered by courier to Karen's house. From what the delivery guy later told me, she accepted it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I didn't expect her to comply, and I was right. 3 days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox that almost made me drop my coffee. It was an official memorandum from the HOA's Environmental Oversight Subcommittee, which, I should note, doesn't exist in any legal filing, stating that my shoreline was under temporary claim reassessment and that I was ordered to cease use. Pending regulatory clarification, Karen had even included a fake letterhead with a gold-embossed logo and a signature line reading Acting Committee Chair K. Brody, I laughed so hard I scared off a nearby deer. That was the last straw. Denise filed a formal civil suit with the Montana District Court, naming Karen Brody as the primary defendant for intentional harassment, fraudulent misrepresentation, distribution of falsified documents, malicious interference with land use. We included screenshots, logs, contractor statements, and videos. Denise even subpoenaed the metadata on the HOA maps Karen had distributed. The timestamps matched her home IP address. Meanwhile, a county investigator followed up on an anonymous tip we helped supply that Karen had used HOA funds to pay for private fencing and signage on land she knew didn't belong to her. 2 contractors agreed to testify, stating she paid them in cash and told them, "Don't worry, it's handled." When the court date was announced, Karen tried to strike back. Her lawyer filed a countersuit claiming I was a hostile actor intent on undermining community cohesion. Denise shredded it in her response, citing every time Karen trespassed, lied, and manufactured jurisdiction. But perhaps the biggest turning point came from someone I never expected, a former board member of the HOA who contacted my attorney anonymously. He had left the association a few months prior, sick of Karen's behavior. Now he wanted to testify. He brought minutes from meetings, internal emails, and one damning detail. Karen had explicitly told the board that the lakefront guy needs to be squeezed until he either joins or gives up. Denise read that line out loud and smiled like a shark, catching scent. We've got motive, method, and misconduct. All we need now is a courtroom. The day of the court hearing began not with a bang, but with frost. A late autumn cold front had swept through Falls Bay overnight, and by the time I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, a thin glaze of ice coated the windshield of every vehicle in sight. I stepped out of my truck, dressed in the stiffest jeans I owned and a jacket that hadn't seen sunlight in 3 years. I looked like a man about to fix a fence, not testify in a civil trial, but that was the point. Karen could bring all the gold embossed stationery she wanted. I had the truth, and the truth wore work boots. Inside the courthouse, the air buzzed with something that felt like expectation. Reporters clustered by the entrance with cameras lowered but ready. HOA residents shuffled into the gallery, some curious, others visibly uncomfortable. A few nodded to me in quiet solidarity. Most avoided eye contact. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a cream pantsuit and oversized sunglasses like she was testifying before Congress. Her lawyer trailed behind her, already sweating through his collar. Denise stood next to me at our table, calm and exacting as always. "We don't have to win over everyone," she whispered. "Just the judge, the record, and the facts. And we've got all three." The hearing began with the usual formalities. Names read into the record, motions acknowledged, exhibits accepted. Then came the plaintiff's opening statement. Denise didn't waste time with theatrics. She spoke with crisp, deliberate cadence, outlining exactly how Karen Brody had overstepped her authority as HOA president to orchestrate a targeted campaign of harassment, trespassing, and fraudulent interference. She not only fabricated documents, Denise said, holding up the infamous HOA memo, but weaponized the reputation of her own organization to pressure and intimidate a private landowner. Mr. Sutton is not a member of Lakeshore Estates. He is not subject to their bylaws. And yet, over the course of 2 months, Ms. Brody used her position to manufacture authority she did not have, issuing false notices, filing baseless complaints with multiple agencies, and misusing HOA resources to fund her vendetta. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her lips pressed, into a line so thin it might have vanished altogether. The defense predictably painted a different picture. Her lawyer claimed Karen was acting in good faith, believing she had legal jurisdiction over the land in question due to ambiguous mapping and decades of assumed use of the shoreline by HOA residents. He framed her as a concerned citizen, merely trying to uphold environmental standards, a steward of her community, a protector of the lake. It was almost impressive if you ignored the part where none of it held water. Our first witness was one of the contractors Karen had hired to install the illegal fencing at my property line. He took the stand in his oil-stained jeans and flannel, clearly nervous, but honest. He testified that Karen had paid him cash, told him the HOA owns this land now, and warned him not to speak to that guy with the cabin. When shown a photograph of the fence, he confirmed it was his work, completed under false pretenses. Then came the former HOA board member, Mr. Jennings, a wiry, retired schoolteacher with a voice like gravel and a spine made of ethics. He testified that Karen had personally instructed the board to apply pressure on me, hoping I would voluntarily submit to HOA regulation. She knew full well the property wasn't part of our jurisdiction, he said, but she didn't care. She wanted control. She wanted everyone nearby to fall in line. Denise brought up the doctored boundary maps next. The court projector displayed them side by side with the original county records. The difference was stark. One had the proper parcel lines. The other showed a bold green highlight stretching conveniently over my shoreline. Then it was my turn. I was sworn in and took the stand. Denise guided me through my testimony, and I spoke clearly, firmly, without drama. I told the court about the family barbecue, the first confrontation, the fake environmental violations, the media ambush, the unrelenting swarm of letters and complaints. I described the moment I realized I was no longer simply defending my land, but my name. Ms. Brody tried to make me look like a lawbreaker, I said, but I've spent my entire adult life restoring ecosystems, not destroying them. I follow regulations most people have never heard of. I work with the state, not around it. This cabin, this land, it's not just mine. It's a legacy. And she treated it like it was a pawn in her political game. Denise finished by playing one final piece of evidence. Security camera footage showing Karen creeping through the woods, measuring tape in hand, jotting in her notebook. The timestamp placed her deep inside my boundary line, well after being warned by law enforcement. The judge asked for a recess. When we returned, Karen took the stand in her own defense. What followed was 25 minutes of the most glorious self-immolation I'd ever witnessed. She was combative. She argued with the judge. She contradicted her own lawyer. She claimed the forged maps were draft concepts and that her use of HOA funds was discretionary spending. At one point, she insisted, "The lake belongs to everyone," to which the judge dryly responded, "Ms. Brody, we are not debating the commons doctrine of the 13th century." By the end of her testimony, even her own lawyer looked like he was praying for a lightning strike. The verdict came swiftly. The judge found in my favor on all counts: harassment, trespass, misrepresentation, and malicious interference. He ruled that Karen Brody had knowingly and repeatedly abused her authority, violated state law, and engaged in behavior unbefitting any civic leader. She was fined $75,000 in damages, ordered to pay my legal fees, and sentenced to 12 months in county jail for submitting falsified documents to a government agency. But perhaps the most satisfying line came at the very end of the ruling. Ms. Brody is hereby barred from holding any administrative or leadership role in any civic association, HOA, or nonprofit entity for a period of no less than 10 years. Karen's face drained of color. The courtroom buzzed with quiet disbelief. Somewhere in the gallery, someone actually applauded and then quickly stopped, as if unsure whether they were allowed to. I just sat there, still, silent, breathing. And for the first time in weeks, the air didn't taste like tension or fire. It tasted like pine and lake water again. After the verdict, the story didn't simply end. It rippled. Like a stone tossed into the lake, the consequences spread outward in every direction. For Karen, the humiliation was swift and absolute. The next morning, local news outlets were already running headlines: HOA president sentenced for fraud, harassment, complete with grainy screenshots of her testimony and a freeze frame of her stunned expression as the sentence was read aloud. Within 48 hours, the Lakeshore Estates HOA held an emergency board meeting. From what I heard, it wasn't particularly civil. Residents were furious, not just at Karen's actions, but at the fact that she had dragged their entire community into her personal vendetta. One longtime homeowner stood up, slammed her dues bill on the table, and asked, "What exactly did my money pay for, other than lawsuits and bad press?" By the end of that meeting, Karen had been officially voted out of the HOA. Not that it mattered. She was already being processed at the Missoula County Jail. Her mugshot appeared on every local feed, eyes half-lidded, mouth pursed like she'd bitten into a lemon. Somewhere in that sterile holding cell, I imagine she realized that the HOA she once ruled like a monarch now regarded her as a public embarrassment. Meanwhile, Denise filed the final paperwork for restitution. The $75,000 in damages wouldn't undo the weeks of stress, intrusion, or sleepless nights, but it felt like justice with a paper trail. My legal fees were reimbursed in full, and more importantly, my land, every acre of it, was now listed in the county records with a special designation: high-profile boundary verification, no dispute. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a steel door slammed shut. But even after the courtroom battle ended, the cleanup remained. Karen's HOA installed fence posts still scarred my western trail. Her handmade protected area signs were still nailed to trees, like warnings from some feral woodland cult. So, I spent the following weekend methodically removing every trace of her self-appointed reign. I pulled the signs down one by one, tossed them into a metal drum, and burned them to ash. Not in defiance, but in ceremony. Then I walked the trail with my sister's boys, pointing out hawk nests and deer prints, and teaching them how to track without spooking the wildlife. We grilled hot dogs that night by the lake, watched the sun dip behind the ridge, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't glance over my shoulder. That Monday, a few HOA residents stopped by, not to argue or lecture, but to apologize. One couple, gray-haired and tired-looking, brought over a pie and stood awkwardly by their car before saying, "We never supported what she did. We just didn't know how to stop her." I told them the truth. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in peace. If they stayed on their side of the line, I'd stay on mine. No wars, no lawsuits, just quiet. They nodded. "Fair enough," the man said. "She made us all look like fools. You handled it better than most would have." That same day, a representative from the Montana Department of Natural Resources stopped by to follow up on one of Karen's last complaints, something about unregistered firewood harvesting. The man took one look around my clean, legally compliant campgrounds, shook his head, and said, "She really wouldn't let this go, huh?" "No," I said, But the forest did. I hung a new sign at the trailhead, carved from reclaimed wood and sealed with marine-grade varnish. It read, "Private property, verified landmark, no trespassing, no exceptions, false reporting will be prosecuted." Below that, in smaller print, "You are not in the HOA, and they are not in charge here." Weeks passed, and the quiet held. I resumed my normal work schedule, traveling to nearby counties to consult on wetland restoration, running soil samples, updating ecosystem plans. But every Friday, without fail, I returned to the cabin, sometimes with friends, sometimes alone. The lake remained clear, the air crisp, the trees indifferent but generous. I heard through the grapevine that Karen was trying to appeal her sentence. Her lawyer apparently left the case 2 weeks after the verdict. A new firm picked it up, filed one motion, and dropped her a week later. Judges don't tend to have much sympathy for forged government records and misuse of HOA funds, and even fewer for people who can't admit they lost. I'd like to say she disappeared from our lives completely, but things are never that tidy. Every so often, I'd get an anonymous email or hear a rumor that she was telling her side of the story on a blog or trying to start a homeowners' rights nonprofit. But she was radioactive now. No HOA in the state would touch her. No community wanted her leadership. And me. I'd become something of a local legend, the guy who beat the HOA president at her own game. Contractors started offering me discounts. One bar named a cocktail after me, the Property Line, served with a cinnamon stick and a shot of local pride. I didn't ask for any of it, but I didn't turn it down either. It's funny what peace feels like after war. Not triumphant, not loud, just still. The kind of stillness that makes you realize how loud things had been for far too long. The lake didn't change, the trees didn't shift, but I did. The last few months had aged me in ways I didn't see until it was over. Creases at the corners of my eyes, a new wariness when picking up an unknown phone number, a sharper ear for the sound of boots on gravel. And yet somehow, I felt lighter. Karen Brody was now a permanent resident of the Missoula County Correctional Facility. Her 12-month sentence wasn't just a punishment, it was a pause, a forced removal from the equation. I wasn't naive enough to think she'd learn anything in there, but at least she couldn't weaponize a clipboard for a while. And judging from the prison intake logs that leaked online, she wasn't exactly adjusting well. Apparently, the first week she demanded to speak to the facility's HOA president. I almost felt bad for her cellmate. Meanwhile, my family returned to our weekend routines like nothing had ever happened. My sister started bringing a guitar and played by the fire. My dad spent entire afternoons in the canoe with my nephews, pointing out birds with Latin names I never remembered. I set up a new water catchment system by the cabin, fully compliant, fully legal, and somehow still a provocation to whatever ghost of Karen still lingered in the weeds. But no one trespassed again. Not after the new signage, not after the trial. The final act of this entire mess came in the form of a certified letter delivered by a slightly embarrassed mailman who'd clearly heard the gossip. It was from the state registry officially affirming that my parcel now held a dispute-protected designation, meaning no entity, not an HOA, not a community board, not a wandering clipboard cult could contest my land's independence without going through a full state-level review. I framed it and nailed it next to the front door of the cabin. Then came the idea that had been quietly growing at the back of my mind since the smoke cleared. Open the land, carefully, selectively. Not to just anyone, not as a business, but as a protected retreat. A place for other people like me, burned out by systems, suffocated by bureaucracy, fed up with power-hungry committees telling them how to live on land they earned. A haven. I filed a quiet application with a nonprofit environmental trust I'd worked with years ago. I outlined a plan for limited-use camping, youth education programs, and seasonal ecology workshops. My land would remain private, protected, but serve a purpose beyond my weekends. 3 months later, it was approved. I'd never imagined that the same place where Karen had tried to nail fake boundary signs to pine trees would one day host local kids learning how to plant native wildflowers without damaging the soil structure. But here we were, full circle. The first group of visitors arrived in early spring, a handful of teens from the city, backpacks too big for their frames, eyes wide as they stepped into the silence of a real forest. One of them pointed at the lake and whispered, "Is this all yours?" I thought about it for a second. "No," I said. but I'm the one who protects it. That night, as they set up tents near the ridge, I sat alone by the fire pit. Yes, the same one that launched 1,000 HOA tantrums, and watched the sparks drift up into the sky like tiny rebellions. The trees creaked around me in approval. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted once. Then again, I smiled. The battle was over. The boundaries were real. The forest had made its choice. And Karen? She'd gone from queen of the HOA to inmate number 53809, eating government-issued meatloaf off a plastic tray while someone else ran her precious meetings without her. Me? I had my lake, my fire, my peace, and not a single clipboard in sight.